December 14th, 1812. The frozen banks of the Berezina River, Russian Empire. A French officer named Captain Henri Beaulieu stumbles through knee-deep snow, his frostbitten fingers clutching a leather journal. Behind him, the remnants of Napoleon's Grande Armée, once 600,000 strong, now reduced to skeletal wraiths, struggle westward through the merciless Russian winter. Beaulieu's entry for that day records something that military historians would later dismiss as delirium. The bear follows still. It has learned to wait. It knows we are dying. 3 days later, when a Cossack patrol discovered Beaulieu's frozen corpse, they found him face down in the snow, his back torn open by massive claws. Around his body were the remains of 7 other French soldiers, arranged in a rough circle, as if they had tried to defend themselves against something that came from the darkness. But the most disturbing detail wasn't in the official Russian military report. It was in a private letter from the Cossack commander to his superiors. The tracks leading away from the scene were not those of a wild animal hunting for food. They followed the road west, toward the retreating French. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the retreat from Moscow Bear, the Grande Armée's four-legged predator that turned Napoleon's greatest military disaster into a supernatural nightmare, make sure to subscribe to Fierce Sermon and ring that notification bell. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers, so drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's journey back to one of history's darkest winters, where the line between man and beast became terrifyingly blurred. The year 1812 marked the zenith of Napoleon Bonaparte's imperial ambitions, and the beginning of his ultimate downfall. On June 24, 1812, the largest European army ever assembled crossed the Neman River into Russia. Napoleon's Grande Armée comprised over 685,000 soldiers drawn from across the French Empire and its satellite states. They marched with the confidence of men who had conquered most of Europe, believing that Russia would fall within weeks, just as Austria, Prussia, and dozens of other nations had fallen before them. But Russia was different. Tsar Alexander I to meet Napoleon in decisive battle. Instead, the Russian forces retreated deeper and deeper into their vast territory, burning crops, destroying bridges, and leaving nothing but scorched earth in their wake. The French advance became a nightmare of heat, disease, and starvation. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, his army had already lost nearly half its strength, without fighting a single major engagement. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow to find it eerily empty. That night, fires began erupting across the city, set by the Russians themselves. For 5 days, Moscow burned. Napoleon waited in the charred ruins for a surrender thaw. Tea never came, and on October 19th, he made the fateful decision to retreat. The temperature was already dropping. Winter arrived early that year. By early November, soldiers were waking to find their comrades frozen solid in their sleep. Horses collapsed and died by the thousands. Discipline disintegrated as men abandoned their units to scavenge for food. The organized columns of the Grande Armée fragmented into desperate mobs of starving, freezing men stumbling westward through an endless white hell. It was in this chaos, where the normal rules of civilization had completely broken down, that something began following the retreating army. The first reports came from the rearguard units in early November. Sentries reported hearing something large moving through the forest at night. Soldiers who strayed from the main columns to forage for food simply disappeared. At first, officers blamed Russian Cossack raiders, who were indeed harassing the French retreat with brutal efficiency. But the Cossacks knew something was wrong too. In a letter dated November 8, 1812, Russian partisan leader Denis Davidov wrote to his commander, "The French speak of a devil in their ranks. My scouts report something follows them, something that takes the weakest when they fall behind. We have found bodies. This is not our work." The French called it l'ours de la retraite, the bear of the retreat. Russian soldiers whispered about Medved Prizrak, the ghost bear. But in those desperate weeks of November 1812, as Napoleon's army slowly died in the snow, it was simply known as the creature that came after dark. Incident 1, the disappeared column, November 10–11, 1812. The first well-documented incident occurred near the town of Vyazma. A supply column of approximately 40 men, too weak to keep pace with the main army, fell behind during a snowstorm. They were under the command of Lieutenant Jacques Montfort, a veteran of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Montfort's final dispatch, written at dusk on November 10th and discovered weeks later in an abandoned farmhouse, reads, "We have taken shelter in a barn 1 league east of Vyazma. The men are exhausted. We will resume at first light. There is something in the tree line. Markovsky swears he saw a bear, enormous in size, watching us from the forest edge. I have ordered the men to keep fires burning through the night. The next morning, a passing cavalry unit discovered the barn. Not broke through, opened it, like a man would. It was a bear, yes, but it moved wrong. It looked at us. It chose. It took the ones who couldn't run, and it left. I watched it walk away on the road, heading west, following the army. The 4 survivors refused to continue with the retreat. They surrendered to the first Russian patrol they encountered, preferring imprisonment to facing that creature again. Incident 2, the Berezina River crossing, November 26, 28, 1812. The crossing of the Berezina River became one of the most catastrophic moments of the retreat. French engineers worked desperately to construct 2 bridges across the partially frozen river, while Russian forces closed in from multiple directions. Thousands of stragglers, camp followers, wounded soldiers, deserters, crowded the eastern bank, desperate to cross before the Russians arrived. It was during this chaos that the creature made its boldest appearance. Sergeant Major François Dumain, who was helping maintain order at the bridge approaches, wrote in his memoir, November 27th, approximately 2 hours before dawn. The mob at the river was in a frenzy. I was trying to organize the wounded into some semblance of a queue when I heard screaming from the rear of the crowd. Not the usual screams of panic, these were screams of mortal terror. The crowd parted like water. People were trampling each other to get away from something. Then I saw it, a brown bear, larger than any I had seen in my years, walking upright through the mass of humanity. It seemed unbothered by the chaos, the noise, the fires. It was hunting. It approached a group of wounded men who could not move from their positions. I ordered my men to fire, and they did. 6 muskets at close range. I saw at least 3 balls strike the creature. Head back into Poland. The survivors, now numbering fewer than 40,000 effective combatants from the original 685,000, thought their ordeal was ending. They were wrong. On Christmas Eve, a column of approximately 300 men from various shattered regiments took shelter in and around a Polish monastery near the town of Mariampol. The abbot, Father Karol Borowski, initially refused to admit French soldiers but relented when he saw their condition. Father Borowski's account, given to Polish authorities in January 1813, provides one of the most detailed descriptions of the creature. They arrived at Vespers, these poor wretches who barely looked human anymore. We gave them what little food we had and allowed them to sleep in the nave and the outbuildings. They were so grateful, many wept. At midnight mass, I noticed that the French sentries posted at the monastery gates had abandoned their positions. I thought perhaps they had come inside for warmth. Then the screaming started. Something was attacking the soldiers in the outbuildings. I heard roaring, a sound that made my blood freeze, and the terrible screams of dying men. The soldiers in the nave grabbed their weapons and rushed outside. I followed, God help me, I followed. In the courtyard, illuminated by torches and moonlight on the snow, I saw it clearly. A massive brown bear standing perhaps 8 feet tall on its hind legs. But it moved with purpose, with intelligence. It had cornered a group of soldiers against the monastery wall and was systematically killing them. The French fired volley after volley. I saw bullets strike its body. It bled. I could see the blood dark against its fur, but it did not stop. It did not flee. It finished what it had started, killing 6 men in front of my eyes, and then it turned and walked away. Not ran, walked, as if it knew no one could stop it. One of the French officers, a colonel I believe, said something I will never forget. He said, "It's been following us since Moscow. It knows we're almost home. It's making sure we remember." 23 men died that night. The survivors abandoned the monastery before dawn, despite being barely able to walk. Father Borowski reported that some of them were crying, not from pain but from hopelessness. They knew the creature wasn't finished with them. Incident 4, the last sighting, January 3, 1813. The final confirmed sighting occurred just inside the Prussian border near the town of Tilsit. By this point, the Grande Armée had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Napoleon had already departed for Paris, leaving the remnants of his army to straggle home as best they could. Marshal Michel Ney, commanding the rearguard, recorded the incident in a dispatch. January 3, 1813. We have crossed into Prussia. Approximately 4,000 men remain under my command. We encountered the creature one final time at dawn. It was standing in the middle of the road watching us approach. For perhaps 5 minutes we fought each other. This bear and the remnants of the greatest army Europe has ever seen. I will not attempt to describe what I saw in its eyes, for no one would believe me. Then it turned and walked back toward Russia. We have not seen it since. I believe it is finished with us. We are broken. We are no longer worth hunting. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten history. What you're about to hear next, the truth behind these incidents, is even more disturbing than the legend. Let's discover what really happened in the winter of 1812. The truth began to emerge not through military records, but through a discovery made decades after the events. In 1897, French historian Auguste Fournier was researching the 1812 campaign in the Russian state archives in St. Petersburg when he uncovered a sealed file marked Classified Military Intelligence Restricted Access. The file contained correspondence between Tsar Alexander I and his intelligence chief, Count Pyotr Tolstoy, regarding what the Russians called Operation Medved, Operation Bear. What Fournier discovered would rewrite the historical understanding of the French retreat. Operation Medved was a psychological warfare program designed by Russian military intelligence. Its architect was a former circus master named Ivan Volkov, who had trained performing bears for the imperial court. Volkov proposed using a trained bear as a weapon of terror against the retreating French. The correspondence reveals the method in chilling detail. In a letter dated October 20, 1812, Volkov wrote, "Your Imperial Majesty, I propose we deploy Misha against the French rearguard. Misha is a brown bear, 12 years old, weighing approximately 450 kilograms. I have trained him since he was a cub. He has performed in imperial theaters for 9 seasons. What makes Misha unique is his conditioning. He has been trained to associate the sound of French military drums and the smell of French army bread rations with food rewards. More importantly, he has been deliberately habituated to human presence and taught to show no fear of musket fire through careful desensitization. I propose we deploy Misha behind French lines with a handler team. We will use French army rations to guide him towards straggler groups. Nature will take its course. A starving, angry bear encountering weakened, isolated men will create casualties, but more importantly, it will create terror and paranoia. The French will spread stories of an unstoppable creature hunting them. In their weakened state, they will believe anything. The psychological impact will be far greater than the actual casualties inflicted." Tsar Alexander approved the operation on October 25th. The correspondence reveals that Misha was deployed with a 3-man handler team, former serfs who had worked with Volkov's circus. They followed the French retreat at a distance, using the bear's conditioning to guide, toward isolated groups of French soldiers. When Misha made a kill, they would reward him with French rations taken from captured supply wagons. The handlers were under strict orders to remain undetected and to let French witnesses escape. The goal was terror, not military efficiency. Count Tolstoy's report to the Tsar, dated December 15, 1812, states, "Operation Medved has exceeded expectations. French prisoners consistently mention a bear hunting their columns. Some claim it is supernatural, others that it is trained by us. The truth does not matter. What matters is that they believe they are being hunted by something they cannot fight or escape. Casualties directly attributable to Misha are estimated at 150-200 men, but the psychological casualties are far greater. French soldiers are abandoning their units, refusing to maintain positions, and choosing capture over exposure to the creature. Some are committing suicide rather than face another night in the open. Misha himself has been wounded several times but continues to function. Volkov reports that the bear has become increasingly aggressive, possibly due to the abundance of food and the winter denning instinct being overridden by our conditioning. The operation was terminated in early January 1813 when the French crossed into Prussia. Misha was recovered by his handlers and returned to St. Petersburg, where he lived out his remaining years in a private menagerie. He died in 1817 of natural causes. Fournier's discovery was published in his 1898 book, The Hidden War, Russian Intelligence Operations During the 1812 Campaign. It caused a sensation in academic circles, but was largely dismissed by the general public. The idea of a trained bear being used as a psychological weapon seemed too bizarre, too theatrical to be true. But the Russian archives don't lie. Among the documents Fournier recovered was a series of sketches made by the handler team showing Misha at various stages of the operation. One sketch, dated November 28, 1812, shows the bear standing upright near a river, blood on its muzzle, a notation beneath it reading, "Berezina crossing. Misha wounded by musket fire but killed 3 French before withdrawal. Extremely aggressive. Volkov suggests we may need to terminate operation early if he becomes uncontrollable." The most chilling document is a final report from Volkov himself, written after Misha's return. Misha has changed. Before the campaign he was playful, responsive, eager to perform. Now he is distant, aggressive, and shows signs of what I can only describe as trauma. He refuses to perform tricks. He watches the door constantly as if expecting soldiers to arrive. He has killed 2 other bears in the menagerie. I believe that what we did to Misha, forcing him to hunt humans, keeping him active through the winter, exposing him to violence and death, has broken something fundamental in his nature. We created a monster, and though we have caged it, I do not think we can undo what was done. If I could counsel His Imperial Majesty, I would advise that such operations never be attempted again. We may have broken the French, but we also broke something else. Something that should not have been broken. The revelation of Operation Medved sent shockwaves through the historical community, but its impact on international relations was even more profound. In 1899, the French government formally protested to Russia, calling Operation Medved a violation of the civilized conduct of warfare. The Russian response was surprisingly frank. Foreign Minister Count Vladimir Lambsdorff stated, "France invaded our homeland with 685,000 soldiers. They burned Moscow. They destroyed hundreds of villages. They killed tens of thousands of Russian civilians. And now they protest that we used a bear? If this is a war crime, then we gladly confess to it, and we would do it again." The French government quietly dropped the matter. There was no appetite for relitigating the Napoleonic Wars over the fate of soldiers who had died nearly 90 years earlier. But within military circles, Operation Medved was studied intensively. It represented one of the first documented uses of psychological warfare as a deliberate, planned strategy rather than a spontaneous tactic. The German General Staff in particular took detailed notes. A Prussian military analysis from 1902 concluded, "The Russian operation demonstrates that terror can be manufactured and deployed as systematically as artillery or cavalry." The actual military effectiveness of the bear was minimal, perhaps 200 casualties over 2 months. But the psychological effect was devastating and impossible to quantify. How many French soldiers broke discipline, abandoned positions, or simply gave up because they feared encountering the creature? This suggests a new paradigm in warfare. Victory is not merely a matter of killing the enemy, it is a matter of breaking his will to fight. If this can be achieved through psychological operations, it may be far more efficient than traditional military means. These conclusions would bear dark fruit in the 20th century, as nations developed increasingly sophisticated psychological warfare programs. What happened to the key figures? Ivan Volkov, the circus master who conceived Operation Medved, remained in Russian imperial service until his death in 1823. He continued to train animals for military purposes, though none of his subsequent projects matched the notoriety of Misha. In his personal journals published posthumously, Volkov expressed profound regret. "I created a legend that will outlive me." Shah, Dmitry Kozlov, Andrei Petrov, and Mikhail Sokolov were all granted their freedom and received substantial pensions from the imperial government. Kozlov eventually emigrated to France in 1825, where he lived under an assumed name. In 1834, he was recognized by a French veteran of the retreat who confronted him in a Paris market. The confrontation was recorded by police. The Frenchman, identifying himself as former Sergeant Claude Bertrand, grabbed Kozlov and shouted, You are the one. I saw you in the forest with the bear." Kozlov attempted to flee but was detained. Under questioning, Kozlov confirmed his role in Operation Medved. Bertrand became agitated and demanded Kozlov be arrested for murder. When informed that no crime had been committed under French law, Bertrand attacked Kozlov with a walking stick, striking him repeatedly while shouting in Russian, "You made us think we were going mad. You made us afraid of shadows." Kozlov was hospitalized with minor injuries. He left France shortly thereafter and returned to Russia, where he died in 1841. The legal and ethical debate, the exposure of Operation Medved, sparked intense debate in European intellectual circles about the ethics of warfare. The Geneva Convention of 1864 was still decades away, and there were no international laws governing the treatment of soldiers in wartime. But philosophers, theologians, and military theorists grappled with the implications. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, in a letter to a colleague in 1899, wrote, "The Russian bear operation fascinates me. It reveals something essential about human nature, that we can be broken not by superior force, but by irrational terror. The French soldiers were defeated not by a military power, but by the fear of something they could not understand. Is this not the essence of psychological warfare, to make the enemy defeat himself?" The Catholic Church took a different view. In a 1900 pastoral letter, Pope Leo III condemned Operation Medved as a perversion of God's creatures and an assault on the dignity of man. To weaponize an animal in this manner, to deliberately inflict terror rather than seek honorable victory in battle, represents a moral failing that should concern all Christian nations. Military historians remain divided. Some, like the French general Henri de Beaumont, argued that Operation Medved was a brilliant tactical innovation that achieved strategic results with minimal resources. Others, like British military theorist Basil Liddell Hart, called it a precedent for the horrors of the 20th century, when nations would routinely employ terror as a weapon against not just soldiers, but civilian populations. The veterans' response, perhaps the most poignant aftermath of the revelation, was its effect on the surviving French veterans of 1812. By 1898, when Fournier's book was published, fewer than 100 veterans of the Russian campaign remained alive. These men, now in their 90s and 100s, had carried the memories of that winter for 8 decades. Many experienced a strange sense of relief when the truth emerged. Private Pierre Marchand, one of the last living survivors, told a French newspaper in 1899, "For 87 years I have wondered if I went mad that winter. I saw things, we all did, that seemed impossible. The bear that hunted us, the way it moved, the way it chose its victims. My comrades who survived would not speak of it. The Army dismissed our reports. Doctors said we were suffering from exposure and trauma. Now I know it was real, all of it. We were not mad. We were victims of a deliberate operation designed to make us think we were mad. I do not know if this knowledge makes the memory better or worse. But at least I know, at least I can die knowing I did not imagine it." But for some veterans the revelation brought only anger. Captain Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, age 108 in 1900, gave a bitter interview. "They used an animal against us, not in battle where we could have fought with honor. They used it to hunt us in the dark when we were starving and freezing and broken. And now they tell me this was strategy? This was military genius? No, this was cruelty. They did not just want to defeat us, they wanted to destroy us, body and mind." The French government established a pension fund for the survivors of the 1812 campaign who could prove psychological trauma from the bear incidents. 17 men applied, all were approved. The last recipient died in 1904, taking the living memory of Misha's campaign with him. The cover-up that never was. Interestingly, there was no cover-up of Operation Medved by the Russian government. The documents were classified but not destroyed. When Fournier requested access to the files, he was granted permission after a relatively brief delay. Historian Maria Volkova, in her 2003 book Psychology and Power, Russian Military Innovation 1800-1850, argues that the Russians were actually proud of Operation Medved. By the late 19th century, Russia was competing with Western European powers for military and intellectual prestige. Operation Medved, once revealed, demonstrated Russian innovation and creativity in warfare. It showed that Russia was not merely a nation of brute force, but capable of sophisticated psychological operations. The fact that it traumatized French soldiers was, from the Russian perspective, entirely justified. France had invaded Russia. France had burned Moscow. Any tactic that helped expel the invaders was legitimate. There was no shame in Operation Medved. There was only pride in its effectiveness. This attitude would have implications for future conflicts. The Russian military continued to explore psychological warfare throughout the 20th century, viewing it as a legitimate and effective tool of statecraft. Operation Medved's legacy extends far beyond the winter of 1812. It represents a watershed moment in military history, the first documented instance of psychological warfare being deployed as a deliberate, pre-planned strategy rather than an improvised tactic. The evolution of psychological warfare. Military historians now recognize Operation Medved as a direct predecessor to 20th century psychological operations. The core principle, that breaking an enemy's will is more efficient than destroying his forces, would become central to modern warfare. During World War I, all major powers established psychological warfare units. The British dropped millions of leaflets over German lines, designed to demoralize enemy soldiers. The Germans used fabricated, atrocity stories to justify their actions and demonize their enemies. The French employed theatrical performances and cinema to boost morale and vilify the enemy. A 1917 British War Office memorandum explicitly references Operation Medved. The Russian Bear operation of 1812 demonstrates that relatively modest investments in psychological operations can yield disproportionate returns. The enemy's imagination becomes a weapon against him. We should explore similar approaches. By World War II, psychological warfare had become institutionalized. The Office of Strategic Services OSS, predecessor to the CIA, ran elaborate disinformation campaigns. The Nazis used propaganda and terror systematically. The Soviets deployed active measures to destabilize enemy societies. Dr. James Hansen, professor of military history at West Point, argues, every psychological operation conducted in the 20th and 21st centuries owes a debt to what the Russians did in 1812. They proved that you could deliberately manufacture terror, deploy it strategically, and achieve measurable results. Once that precedent was established, there was no going back. Similar cases that emerged once Fournier published his findings. Other historical incidents were re-examined through the lens of deliberate psychological warfare. In 1905, a French military historian named Antoine Mercier published a paper arguing that several mysterious incidents during the Peninsular War, 1807–1814, may have been early British psychological operations. Spanish guerrillas fighting against French occupation reported seeing ghost monks in abandoned monasteries, figures dressed in religious habits who would appear suddenly, terrify French soldiers, and vanish. Mercier argued these were likely British Special Operations Forces deliberately cultivating supernatural fear. Similarly, historians revisited accounts from the American Civil War. Confederate soldiers in Virginia reported being stalked by a phantom drummer boy whose drums could be heard, but who could never be found. Union military records, declassified in 1935, confirmed that the 5th New York Infantry had deployed a drummer to play behind Confederate lines at night, specifically to disrupt sleep and create paranoia. The pattern was clear. Once military leaders understood that fear could be weaponized, they began weaponizing it systematically. Impact on the community and historical memory. In Russia, Misha became a source of national pride. Children's books celebrated the bear who defeated Napoleon. In 1912, on the 100th anniversary of the French retreat, the Russian government unveiled a statue in Smolensk depicting a bear driving out the French invaders. It stands there still. In France, the response was more complicated. Misha became a symbol of national humiliation, a reminder that the Grande Armée had been defeated not just by Russian arms, but by Russian cunning. French military academies studied Operation Medved not to celebrate it, but to learn from it and prevent similar tactics being used against France in future conflicts. The town of Mariupol, Poland, where Father Borowski witnessed the Christmas Eve attack, erected a memorial in 2012 on the 200th anniversary. The inscription reads, "To the soldiers of all nations who suffered in the winter of 1812, may their pain remind us that war's cruelty takes many forms. What this reveals about human nature, perhaps the most disturbing implication of Operation Medved, is what it reveals about the vulnerability of the human psyche." Psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Morse, in her 2018 book, The Terror Factor, Psychological Warfare and Human Nature, writes, "What the Russians discovered in 1812 is that humans are far more afraid of the unknown than the known. A Russian soldier with a rifle is a concrete threat that can be understood and responded to, but something that hunts you in the darkness, something that seems to defy explanation, that creates an existential terror that breaks rational thought. The French soldiers who encountered Misha were not cowards. They were veterans of dozens of battles. They had faced cavalry charges, artillery barrages, and bayonet charges, but they could not psychologically process an animal that hunted them with apparent intelligence and purpose. Their minds simply could not categorize the threat, and so they defaulted to supernatural explanations. This reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology. We need the world to make sense. When it doesn't, when we encounter something that violates our understanding of how things should work, we become vulnerable to panic, paranoia, and psychological collapse. This vulnerability is what makes psychological warfare so devastatingly effective. The lessons of Operation Medved remain relevant today. Modern military forces use drones, cyber warfare, and disinformation campaigns to create uncertainty and fear in enemy populations. The technology has changed, but the principle remains the same: break the enemy's mind and you break the enemy. The ethical question that remains the final implication is ethical. When does military innovation cross the line into cruelty? The Russians argued then, and argue now, that Operation Medved was a legitimate military operation. The French invaded Russia. The Russians used the resources available to them, including trained animals, to resist. In the context of total war for national survival, Any tactic that works is justified. But others argue that deliberately inflicting psychological trauma, creating lasting mental damage that would haunt men for decades, represents a moral line that should not be crossed. The French soldiers who survived 1812 carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Some, like Private Marchand, lived in doubt and fear for 87 years before learning the truth. Was their suffering necessary? Was it justified? Or does the effectiveness of psychological warfare make it morally imperative to renounce it? These questions remain unanswered. But what is certain is that Operation Medved opened a door that has never been closed. We now live in a world where psychological warfare is ubiquitous, where information and disinformation are weapons as powerful as missiles and bombs. And it all began with a trained bear following a broken army through the snow. What do you think drove the Russian military leadership to deploy an animal as a weapon of psychological terror? Was Operation Medved a brilliant tactical innovation, or does it represent a moral line that should never have been crossed? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you've ever experienced something that made you question your own sanity, something that seemed impossible but felt terrifyingly real, share your story with our community. This is the power of psychological warfare. It doesn't just defeat armies, it rewrites reality itself. Subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more lost chapters of history where the line between fact and nightmare becomes terrifyingly blurred. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew. The past is darker than we remember, and sometimes the monsters were real. See you in the next video.